The War of the Spanish Succession took place on many fronts across the globe. It now returns to its home in Spain. Last time, the Allies successfully captured Gibraltar, created the Principality of Catalonia in the east, and briefly occupied Madrid. The Bourbon army was severely weakened, but the Allies had overstretched their lines of communication and supply. Leading the Allies were the Duke of Galway, a former French Huguenot who vowed revenge on the Catholic French, and the Marquis de Minas, the general of the Portuguese contingent, along with a few other generals and military leaders from the Netherlands and Britain. Opposing them was the Duke of Berwick, an ironically English Irishman in exile who, similar to Galway, entered service against his former allies, and Philip V, the Bourbon candidate for the throne of the Spanish Empire. Spain was arguably the most important front of the whole war. Whoever controlled it would almost certainly win the succession crisis. In the Year of Miracles for the Allies, an Anglo-Dutch fleet relieved Philip V's own attempt to retake the city of Barcelona. Catalonians, British, Dutch, Portuguese, and Austrians fought together against the French and Bourbon Spanish. The diversion of troops from Madrid also allowed for its capture earlier. Philip V was cut off from Madrid, now forced to withdraw into southern France for the time being. Last episode, the Bourbons regrouped and followed Galway's trail. Galway and Minas had retreated to the region of Valencia, recently conquered by the Allies. Galway managed to receive a few thousand reinforcements, theoretically making his army around 16,000 to 18,000 men strong. Berwick had also received reinforcements from the newly reformed Spanish army. In the early years of the war, the Spanish army followed the tercio system. Its soldiers were barely armed, trained, and uniformed. Philip V and French officers reformed the army along French lines, with the key distinction in the basic uniform being the red cockade. Over the last few years, it was finely tuned into a much more proficient fighting force. Around the same time, an Anglo-Dutch fleet under Admiral Cloudesley Shovel and land forces under the Imperial and Piedmontese armies laid siege to the important city of Toulon. It harbored most of the Mediterranean French fleet. If taken, it would also allow for the occupation of southern France and the diversion of troops from Spain. Berwick knew he would need to seek out the Allies and rout them in a decisive battle, and hoped that Marshal Villars would hold Toulon in a heroic defense. Galway understood this as well. Both armies knew it was time to fight the decisive pitched battle in Spain they had so hoped for so long. Both armies had so much at stake. Believing both armies to be balanced, he and Berwick would find each other toward the town of Almansa in Valencia. It is the 25th of April, 1707. The Allied and French deployment resembled what commanders of the era considered an ideal deployment. Infantry and artillery concentrated in the center, with cavalry on both wings. The flat and relatively plain terrain before Almansa was perfect ground for a conventional battle of the age, unlike in Flanders and Germany, where terrain wasn't always so open and flat. Berwick prepared before the village itself. Berwick formed his men to counter them. Possessing a numerically superior army of around 22,000 to 25,000 men. Galway possessed only around 16,500, but it could be the case that he had understated his strength to cover for what was about to happen, considering he possessed around 18,000 men a few days earlier, but this is all speculation. For Galway, though, it could have been much worse. Philip de Orleans had not arrived for the battle with his army of 8,000 men. The battle would soon begin in the mid-afternoon. On the Bourbon left, the Franco-Spanish cavalry advanced first at a trot, sounding bugle calls to advance. The trot then turned into a charge, and the Bourbon cavalry smashed their way into the Portuguese cavalry, advancing to meet them. The Portuguese cavalry fought much better than expected, but they were forced to retire. The Franco-Spanish cavalry and dragoons had now smashed their way through, now heading towards the Portuguese infantry under Das Minas. But the Portuguese infantry formed square just in time, and with a few good volleys, inflicted some losses onto Alvarez's cavalry. And now soon, the Bourbon cavalry was forced to retire, but not with huge losses. Now it could get time to regroup. Berwick saw the weakened Allied center now lacked cavalry support. Still reforming from their squares, the Portuguese infantry could not advance either, so Berwick ordered Bulkeley's brigade forward under Lieutenant General Hesse. Bulkeley's men were Irish, otherwise known as the Wild Geese, which were so common in the French and Spanish armies, going back and forth on the Allied right for most of the battle. Trouble began to show its head in the center for Berwick. Galway, wishing to take pressure away from his own right flank, threw forward his Dutch and British battalions under General Earl in the center. They were met with some well-aimed volleys, but did not stop their charge. Seeing the Allied center being thrown towards him beforehand, Berwick sent forward his right-wing Spanish cavalry under the Duke of Popoli and General de Asfeld. Some charged the flanks of the advancing infantry, and some went towards the British and Dutch cavalry under Galway himself. The Spanish Guardias Reales de Corps were met with gunfire from their opponents, but drove the attack home. Galway counterattacked with his own cavalry and made it to the Bourbon line. Reacting in time to the changing combat, the main infantry brigade divided itself into 3 divisions. One covered the Guardias de Corps, and the other 2 engaged head-on with Waite's infantry brigade. General de Asfeld followed up with bringing another line of cavalry against Galway, pinning him down on the Bourbon right. Back to the center, the Allied infantry pushed to the walls of Almansa. The Queen's Royal Regiment and a battalion of foot guards were making considerable headway. So far, it seemed like the battle was going well, but only on the Allied left. But on the Allied right, the Portuguese were finally faltering in their attempt to hold off the Bourbon cavalry. The Portuguese infantry were soon nearly completely rolled over and were forced to make a hasty withdrawal, which turned to a rout. The Allied right wing completely collapsed and routed off the field. Dasminus desperately tried to rally his broken forces, but to no avail. Some of the cavalry would come around to come down onto the Allied infantry in the center. With this, the Bourbon infantry reserves were ordered forward by Berwick to repulse the British and Dutch infantry, including the Spanish and Walloon Guard infantry. With the Allies also came a unique unit, the French Huguenots, Protestant French eager to seek revenge as much as Galway did against the Catholic French government. General Labadie and Saint-Gilles infantry were pushed back in the center of the battlefield, but did not break. The Franco-Spanish cavalry gave forward a general charge against the heavily battered and spread thin Allied lines. The Allied left under Galway also could no longer withstand the great assault by the Spanish cavalry. The Allied fire had previously forced the Guards to regroup for another attack, which this time broke into the second line of the Allied cavalry on the Allied left, sweeping away the British cavalry from the field completely. The Allied infantry in the center were slowly being cut off from what remained of the Allied line. Galway himself was wounded in the Spanish charge and brought to the rear. The Allied army now suffered from lack of central leadership. Although some Allied artillery was safely removed from the field, with whatever battalions were left to guard it, the battle in the center was slowly repulsed by the coming reserves. And the fight there would last for 2 more hours. Nearly all of the Allied infantry were killed, wounded, or captured. The battle had quickly turned into an Allied disaster. Berwick's army lost around anywhere from 2,000 men to 5,000 men killed in the battle, whilst the Allies suffered a far worse 5,000 men killed or wounded and another 7,000 to 10,000 men captured, nearly the entire Allied army, along with an unknown number of colors and some artillery. Sources do vary on the casualty numbers, but it was clear beyond casualties that this was an Allied disaster. A few more battalions were destroyed the next morning after being left behind by Galway's army. Many of these were battalions that enjoyed earlier success in Flanders, but now tasted bitter defeat. The effects of the battle shook the Grand Alliance. Berwick recaptured the entire Valencia province by the end of the year, and other generals like the Marquis de Bay recaptured the western regions and cities such as Badajoz and Ciudad Rodrigo. The rest of the Allied army limped its way to Catalonia. When they arrived, the Portuguese army returned home to reopen the Portuguese front and defend their homeland from any possible invasion. And also, the city of Zaragoza and its surrounding province fell just as quickly as the rest. The Allied forces in the east were so shattered that they could not conduct any significant offensive for the next 3 years. They now had to rely on the hope of Austrian reinforcements from Italy and the raising of Charles III's new, but small, Habsburg Spanish army to defend what was left for the time being. British and Dutch reinforcements would not regroup in Portugal until 1708. The Allied siege of Toulon also suffered from the defeat at Almansa. The victory allowed the Bourbons to send a field army to relieve the city. The siege inflicted over 13,000 casualties on the armies of Eugen and Amadeus, forcing them to withdraw and save southern France. Villars' heroic defense had saved the vulnerable front for good.